There are nights when Winston, a small gray mouse wearing a carefully pressed charcoal vest and a slightly loosened tie after another exhausting workday, sits alone near the corner of his apartment window staring at the glowing numbers on his retirement account screen. And although the city outside continues moving with its endless rhythm of traffic lights, distant sirens, and illuminated office towers, his thoughts remain completely fixed on a single uncomfortable realization quietly forming in his mind. What if the greatest danger to his future is not some dramatic market crash, another recession, or an unexpected emergency, but instead a series of small financial mistakes he has been repeating for years without even noticing? Because for most of his adult life, Winston believed retirement success belonged mainly to people who earned extraordinary salaries, understood complicated investing strategies, or somehow possessed a natural instinct for money management. Yet the older he became, the more he started noticing something deeply unsettling among coworkers, neighbors, and even older relatives who had worked for decades only to arrive near retirement feeling anxious, exhausted, and financially unprepared despite earning respectable incomes throughout their careers. And as he adjusted his glasses and leaned back into the silence of the room, Winston slowly began understanding that financial disasters rarely happen all at once. Instead, they grow quietly over time through tiny decisions that initially seem harmless. Decisions like delaying contributions for another year, choosing safety over growth, borrowing from retirement accounts during stressful moments, or assuming there will always be more time later to fix everything. And perhaps the most frightening part of all is that these mistakes often feel reasonable in the moment they are made, which is exactly why millions of people continue repeating them year after year, without realizing how severely they are damaging their future selves. Meanwhile, the mathematics of compound growth continues operating in the background with absolute indifference, magnifying both discipline and neglect equally, rewarding those who begin early and punishing those who hesitate too long. And as Winston opened an old notebook filled with calculations he had been making late at night after work, he noticed something that genuinely unsettled him. Even relatively small mistakes involving employer matching, investment allocation, or unnecessary fees could eventually snowball into losses so massive they would equal entire homes, decades of financial freedom, or years of peaceful retirement life. And suddenly retirement planning no longer felt like a distant abstract concept reserved for older people, because it now felt intensely personal. As though every small decision he made today was quietly negotiating the quality of his future existence decades later. And while many people around him continued treating their retirement accounts like background paperwork they barely understood, Winston could no longer ignore the uncomfortable truth that financial security is often determined less by brilliance and more by avoiding a handful of deeply common mistakes, repeated consistently over very long periods of time. As the soft hum of the refrigerator echoed through the apartment and the rain outside began tapping gently against the glass, Winston remained seated at his desk with a growing sense of unease, because the more he studied retirement planning, the more he realized that one of the costliest mistakes people make is astonishingly simple, almost embarrassingly easy to avoid. And yet millions continue making it every single year without fully understanding the long-term consequences. He thought about the conversations he overheard in office break rooms where coworkers casually joked about contributing, just enough for now, to their retirement accounts because rent was expensive, vacations felt necessary, or retirement still seemed too far away to deserve immediate attention. And although those explanations sounded understandable on the surface, Winston had recently discovered a painful truth hidden underneath them. Many of these people were unknowingly refusing free money being offered directly by their employers through matching contributions. And once he truly understood how employer matching worked, he could not stop thinking about how irrational it seemed from a financial perspective. Because, unlike stock market speculation or risky investment trends, This was not uncertain money dependent on luck or timing. This was guaranteed compensation, willingly offered by companies to employees simply for contributing enough to qualify. And yet, enormous numbers of workers consistently failed to capture the full amount available to them every year. As Winston adjusted the sleeve of his vest and reviewed the numbers again, he imagined a worker earning a modest salary who contributes only half the percentage necessary to receive the maximum employer match, believing they are saving money in the short term, while failing to realize they are effectively rejecting thousands of dollars of additional compensation over time. And what made this realization especially disturbing to him was the way compound growth transforms seemingly small missed opportunities into devastating long-term losses, because every dollar not contributed today is not merely one missing dollar, but rather decades of future growth that never gets the chance to exist at all. In his notebook, he carefully wrote down a simple example that kept replaying in his thoughts. If someone misses even a relatively small employer match each year throughout a long career, the final loss at retirement could easily exceed hundreds of thousands of dollars once investment growth is included, meaning a decision that initially felt financially insignificant during someone's 20s could eventually reshape the entire quality of their later life. And suddenly, Winston began seeing employer matching differently, not as a minor workplace benefit hidden somewhere inside onboarding paperwork, but as one of the most powerful wealth-building tools available to ordinary workers who may never earn extraordinary salaries. The tragedy, however, was that most people never treated it with the seriousness it deserved, because the human mind struggles to emotionally value future rewards that are decades away, especially when present-day bills, stress, and uncertainty feel far more immediate. And as he stared out at the blurred city lights reflecting across the rain-covered streets below, Winston realized that retirement mistakes often begin not with recklessness, but with underestimating how valuable small, consistent actions become when time is allowed to multiply them quietly in the background for 30 or 40 uninterrupted years. Later that evening, after pouring himself another cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm from sitting untouched beside stacks of financial notes, Winston found his thoughts drifting toward another mistake that at first glance appears responsible, cautious, and even intelligent, yet over time quietly destroys enormous amounts of future wealth without most people ever noticing it happening. Throughout his life, he had always associated safety with stability, and stability with keeping money protected from loss, which is why for years he instinctively believed that the safest place for retirement savings was somewhere conservative, where balances would not fluctuate dramatically during frightening market downturns. But the deeper he researched long-term investing, the more he began understanding that safety itself can sometimes become dangerous when misunderstood. Because many workers treat their retirement accounts less like investment vehicles designed for long-term growth and more like oversized savings accounts, meant simply to avoid short-term discomfort. And while that mindset feels emotionally comforting during periods of economic uncertainty, it often creates a far more destructive risk operating silently beneath the surface. The gradual erosion of purchasing power caused by inflation and insufficient growth over decades. Winston remembered speaking with an older coworker who proudly explained that he had kept most of his retirement money in extremely conservative funds for years because he didn't want to gamble with his future. And although the statement sounded wise emotionally, the numbers painted an entirely different story once examined over long periods of time. Because retirement planning is not merely about preserving money, but about growing it enough to outpace inflation, rising living costs, healthcare expenses, and the increasing financial demands of aging itself. And this realization unsettled Winston deeply because it forced him to confront an uncomfortable paradox. Avoiding market volatility entirely may actually be one of the riskiest financial choices a young investor can make. As he opened his laptop and compared different long-term projections late into the night, The contrast became impossible to ignore, since relatively modest monthly contributions invested conservatively often grew into surprisingly small balances after decades, while the exact same contributions placed into diversified stock investments historically produced dramatically larger outcomes simply because compound growth had more room to operate. And although stock markets inevitably experienced crashes, recessions, and terrifying headlines throughout those years, time itself consistently rewarded long-term participation far more generously than excessive caution ever could. The psychological difficulty, however, was that human beings naturally experience temporary losses far more intensely than future gains, which explains why so many people panic when markets decline, even though those downturns are often normal parts of long investment cycles. And Winston slowly realized that retirement investing requires a completely different emotional framework than ordinary saving, because success depends less on eliminating short-term discomfort and more on tolerating uncertainty long enough for compound growth to perform its almost invisible work over many decades. Meanwhile, inflation continues moving quietly in the background every single year, whether investors acknowledge it or not, gradually reducing the real-world value of idle cash while creating the illusion of safety through stable account balances. And as the rain outside finally began to slow into silence, Winston leaned back in his chair with a heavy awareness settling over him that many people who believe they are protecting their futures may actually be sacrificing enormous long-term wealth simply because temporary market volatility feels emotionally scarier than the slow, invisible damage caused by decades of insufficient growth. As midnight crept quietly across the city and the glow from Winston's desk lamp became the only light remaining in the apartment, he found himself studying another retirement mistake that almost nobody notices in the beginning precisely because it hides behind percentages so small they appear completely harmless. And yet over the course of an entire career, those tiny percentages slowly consume astonishing amounts of wealth without ever announcing themselves loudly enough for most people to react. Unlike market crashes or sudden financial emergencies, investment fees rarely create panic because they do not arrive as dramatic losses visible in a single moment. Instead, they quietly drain growth year after year in the background, while investors remain focused on account balances, headlines, and short-term performance. And this invisibility is exactly what makes them so dangerous. Winston had always assumed that fees attached to retirement investments were relatively insignificant, because many financial companies described them using language that sounded technical and reassuring, percentages like 1% or 1.5% appearing almost meaningless at first glance. But one evening, while reviewing long-term investment projections, he noticed something that genuinely shocked him. Even a small increase in annual fees could eventually reduce retirement wealth by tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars simply because compound growth amplifies costs the same way it amplifies returns. And once he saw the numbers side by side, he could no longer ignore how brutally mathematics punishes unnecessary expenses over long periods of time. He imagined two ordinary workers contributing the exact same amount every month for decades, both earning similar market returns before fees, yet one choosing low-cost index funds, while the other unknowingly remained invested in expensive, actively managed funds, recommended through confusing retirement plan menus. And although the yearly difference between them initially appeared trivial, after 30 years, the lower-fee investor could easily end up with dramatically more wealth despite taking no additional risk and earning no superior investment performance whatsoever, which forced Winston to confront another uncomfortable realization about human behavior. People often devote more energy researching televisions, smartphones, or vacation deals than they do understanding the hidden costs inside the accounts meant to support them for the final decades of their lives. What frustrated him even more was discovering that higher fees do not reliably produce better results, despite the common assumption that expensive investments must somehow be more sophisticated or effective. Because countless long-term studies have shown that low-cost diversified index funds frequently outperform higher-cost actively managed alternatives once fees are subtracted from returns. Meaning many investors are not merely paying more, but potentially paying more for worse outcomes over time. As Winston loosened his tie and stared at the spreadsheets scattered across his desk, he realized that one of the greatest challenges in retirement planning is that the most destructive problems are often the least emotionally visible, because people react strongly to dramatic market declines, while barely noticing slow structural losses quietly compounding against them year after year. And this creates a dangerous illusion where investors feel emotionally safe despite gradually surrendering enormous portions of their future financial freedom to avoidable expenses they never fully understood in the first place. Outside his apartment, the streets had become almost completely silent now, but inside his mind the calculations continued echoing relentlessly, because once Winston understood how profoundly small recurring fees could reshape an entire retirement outcome, he could no longer view those percentages as harmless details hidden in paperwork, but instead as silent forces capable of determining whether decades of disciplined saving ultimately produced comfort, anxiety, or financial regret later in life. By the time the clock beside Winston's desk crept past 1 in the morning, exhaustion had already settled heavily across his shoulders, yet his mind refused to rest because another dangerous pattern kept resurfacing in his thoughts, one that countless workers justify during stressful periods of life, without realizing how severely it can disrupt decades of financial progress. And the more he reflected on it, the more he understood why so many retirement experts speak about 401k loans with such caution despite how convenient they initially appear. From the outside, borrowing from a retirement account sounds almost harmless, even logical, because unlike a bank loan, there is no intimidating lender sitting across a desk judging your credit history, no complicated approval process, and no feeling of owing money to someone else, since technically the money already belongs to you, which is exactly why the idea becomes so psychologically tempting during moments of financial pressure. Winston imagined a worker facing rising debt, an expensive emergency, or the opportunity to make a down payment on a home, staring at a retirement balance accumulated over years and thinking, why should I borrow from a bank and pay interest to strangers when I can simply borrow from myself instead? And on the surface, that reasoning sounds incredibly persuasive, because it creates the comforting illusion of control while disguising the deeper long-term consequences quietly developing underneath. However, as Winston reviewed how these loans actually function, he realized that the true cost extends far beyond the amount borrowed, because the moment retirement money leaves the market, it loses access to the compounding engine responsible for generating long-term growth in the first place, meaning the borrower is not only repaying principal and interest, but also sacrificing the future investment returns that money might have earned during critical years of market participation. This hidden opportunity cost disturbed him deeply because it revealed how easy it is for short-term thinking to interrupt processes that require uninterrupted time to become powerful. And while many borrowers focus only on repayment schedules and interest rates, very few stop to calculate how much future wealth disappears when compound growth is temporarily interrupted for several years during important accumulation periods. Yet what frightened Winston even more was learning what happens when someone leaves their job before fully repaying the loan, because suddenly, what once felt like a manageable financial shortcut can transform into a crisis almost overnight. Since many retirement plans require outstanding balances to be repaid within a very short period after employment ends, and if repayment becomes impossible, the remaining balance may be treated as an early withdrawal subject to taxes and painful penalties, creating a devastating scenario where someone already facing unemployment career transition, or financial uncertainty, is now burdened with additional obligations precisely when stability matters most. As he sat quietly listening to the faint sound of distant traffic below his apartment building, Winston realized that retirement loans often expose one of the most dangerous weaknesses in human financial behavior: the tendency to underestimate the long-term cost of solving short-term discomfort. Because when stress enters someone's life, future consequences become emotionally blurry, while immediate relief suddenly feels overwhelmingly important. And yet retirement investing depends almost entirely on protecting long-term consistency from those emotionally charged interruptions. The cruel irony, Winston thought, is that many people take these loans believing they are being resourceful and financially responsible, never realizing that the money they temporarily remove from their future may eventually become worth several times more than the immediate problem they were trying so desperately to solve. And as the final drops of rain slid slowly down the dark window beside him, he could not stop wondering how many people approaching retirement today carry hidden regret over decisions that once seemed practical during difficult moments years earlier, but quietly stole decades of compound growth they can never fully recover again. As another quiet wave of exhaustion passed through the apartment, and the pale glow of early morning slowly began appearing behind distant buildings, Winston found himself thinking about one of the most emotionally destructive investing mistakes of all. A mistake so deeply connected to human psychology that even intelligent, disciplined people continue repeating it generation after generation, despite overwhelming evidence against it. And the more he reflected on market history, the clearer it became that many investors do not actually fail because they lack access to good investments, but because fear and emotion eventually overpower their ability to remain consistent during periods of uncertainty. Throughout his life, Winston had noticed how dramatically people's confidence changed depending on whether markets were rising or falling. Because when stock prices climbed rapidly, everyone around him suddenly sounded optimistic, ambitious, and eager to invest more money as though prosperity itself had become inevitable. Yet the moment markets declined and headlines turned frightening, that same confidence often disappeared almost instantly, replaced by panic, hesitation, and desperate attempts to protect money by moving everything into cash right when prices were already deeply discounted. And although this pattern feels emotionally natural, it creates one of the most financially damaging behaviors possible: buying high during excitement and selling low during fear. Winston remembered reading stories from major market crashes, where ordinary workers stopped contributing to retirement accounts entirely because they became convinced the economy was collapsing permanently. And at the time, their decisions probably felt rational because fear has an incredible ability to make temporary pain feel endless. Yet years later, many of those same investors watched markets recover dramatically without them, because they abandoned long-term investing precisely when future returns were becoming most attractive. This realization unsettled Winston because it revealed something deeply uncomfortable about human nature itself, namely that people often crave certainty during moments when long-term success actually requires patience, discomfort, and emotional restraint instead. As he studied charts showing decades of market history stretching through recessions, crashes, wars, inflation, and recoveries, he noticed a recurring pattern that repeated with astonishing consistency. Periods of extreme fear eventually gave way to recovery, growth, and new highs. Yet every cycle still convinced millions of investors that this time is different, causing them to interrupt their long-term plans in moments of panic only to regret those decisions later once stability returned. What fascinated Winston most was the idea that market volatility itself is not necessarily the enemy of long-term investors, but rather a natural feature of investing that creates opportunities for disciplined people willing to continue buying during uncomfortable periods. Because when contributions continue through payroll deductions during market declines, Investors are automatically purchasing more shares at lower prices, allowing future recoveries to generate even larger gains over time. And although this process sounds simple intellectually, emotionally it becomes extraordinarily difficult once terrifying headlines dominate television screens, and everyone around you begins acting as though disaster is permanent. Meanwhile, social pressure intensifies the problem even further because fear spreads quickly through workplaces, families, news media, and online conversations, making it psychologically exhausting to remain calm while others panic around you. And as Winston slowly turned another page in his notebook filled with long-term projections, he began understanding why successful retirement investing often depends less on intelligence and more on emotional endurance. Because the greatest financial advantage many investors could develop is simply the ability to continue behaving rationally while others surrender to fear. Outside, the first signs of dawn were beginning to soften the darkness over the city streets below. But inside the apartment, Winston sat quietly realizing that markets will almost certainly continue frightening people for the rest of his lifetime. And yet history repeatedly rewards those who resist the urge to abandon long-term investing during temporary chaos, even though doing so may feel emotionally unnatural in the moment it matters most. As the first pale sunlight of morning slowly filtered through the curtains and cast long shadows across the papers scattered around his desk, Winston rubbed his tired eyes and found himself reflecting on another retirement mistake that rarely feels catastrophic in the moment it happens, yet quietly destroys extraordinary amounts of future wealth over time, because it usually occurs during periods of transition when people are distracted, emotionally overwhelmed, or focused on immediate life changes rather than distant financial consequences. Throughout his career, Winston had watched coworkers move between companies with excitement, anxiety, and uncertainty all mixed together as they chased higher salaries, escaped stressful environments, or searched for better opportunities. And during those transitions, retirement accounts often became little more than forgotten paperwork buried beneath moving expenses, new schedules, onboarding documents, and the emotional pressure of starting over somewhere unfamiliar. Which is exactly why so many people make deeply expensive decisions regarding old 401k balances without fully understanding what they are sacrificing. At first, the temptation can seem harmless because when someone leaves a job and sees a retirement account containing perhaps $10,000 or $15,000, the balance may not appear life-changing compared to immediate financial needs such as paying off debt, covering relocation costs, repairing a vehicle, or finally purchasing something they had delayed for years. And in moments like these, cashing out the account can feel emotionally satisfying because it transforms inaccessible future money into immediate present-day relief. Yet as Winston examined the long-term mathematics behind those decisions, he realized the true cost is almost impossible to emotionally grasp in the moment because what people are actually giving up is not merely the current balance itself, but the decades of compound growth that balance could still generate if left untouched. He imagined a 30-year-old worker withdrawing $15,000 after changing jobs, feeling temporarily relieved after receiving the reduced amount remaining after taxes and penalties, perhaps believing they had solved a pressing financial problem, while completely unaware that the same untouched investment might eventually grow into hundreds of thousands of dollars by retirement age simply because time would continue multiplying it quietly in the background for another 30 or 35 years. What disturbed Winston most was how invisible this trade-off feels psychologically, because human beings naturally experience immediate cash as more emotionally valuable than distant future wealth, especially when retirement still feels abstract and unimaginably far away. And this emotional bias causes many people to unknowingly exchange massive future financial security for relatively modest short-term comfort during stressful periods of life. Meanwhile, the penalties attached to early withdrawals make the situation even worse because taxes and additional fees immediately reduce the amount received, meaning investors are often sacrificing assets with enormous long-term growth potential in exchange for only a fraction of their actual value. And once Winston framed the situation this way in his mind, cashing out retirement accounts during job changes began to resemble selling pieces of one's future at a steep discount, simply because present circumstances temporarily felt overwhelming. He also noticed another subtle psychological danger hidden inside these decisions, because once someone breaks the mental boundary protecting retirement money from everyday spending, future withdrawals often become easier to justify emotionally, gradually transforming accounts originally intended for long-term security into emergency reservoirs repeatedly tapped whenever life becomes difficult. And over many years, this pattern can completely derail retirement planning without any single decision ever appearing disastrous on its own. As the city outside slowly awakened with the distant sounds of traffic and commuters beginning another workday, Winston leaned back in his chair with a heavy awareness settling inside him that retirement wealth is often not destroyed by one dramatic financial collapse, but rather by ordinary moments of impatience, stress, and short-term thinking, repeated quietly throughout decades of adult life, until the future finally arrives, and there is far less waiting there than people once assumed there would be. As the morning light continued spreading slowly across the apartment, and the city outside fully awakened into another ordinary workday filled with rushing commuters, crowded trains, and endless schedules, Winston remained seated in silence because there was still one final mistake lingering heavily in his thoughts. And unlike the others, this one felt especially tragic to him because it rarely comes from recklessness, greed, or irresponsibility, but instead from a quiet belief shared by countless people that there will always be more time later to start preparing for the future. Throughout his younger years, Winston himself had often postponed serious retirement planning for reasons that sounded perfectly reasonable at the time, telling himself he needed to first stabilize his career, eliminate debt, build emergency savings, or simply enjoy life a little before focusing on something as distant as old age. And for a while those delays felt harmless because when someone is young, decades appear so abundant that sacrificing a few years seems emotionally insignificant. Yet the deeper he studied compound growth, the more he realized that time itself may actually be the most valuable financial asset a person ever possesses, far more powerful than intelligence, income level, or even investment skill. What made this realization so painful was understanding how brutally compound interest rewards those who begin early while simultaneously punishing those who wait too long. Because money invested during one's 20s often has decades longer to multiply than money invested later in life, meaning even relatively small contributions made early can eventually outperform much larger contributions started years afterward. And once Winston fully grasped this concept, he could no longer view procrastination as a harmless delay, but rather as the gradual surrender of future financial freedom piece by piece over time. He remembered reading about two investors whose stories stayed with him long after closing the book, because the first person began contributing modest amounts very early in adulthood and then stopped after only several years, while the second waited much longer to begin, but eventually contributed significantly more money overall during the remainder of their career, and despite investing less total money. The early starter still ended retirement with greater wealth, simply because compound growth had been given far more time to operate uninterrupted, a reality that felt almost unfair emotionally, yet remained mathematically undeniable. As Winston stared quietly at the reflection of sunlight across his coffee cup, he realized why so many people become overwhelmed later in life, when they finally calculate how much they need to save in order to catch up. Because delaying retirement investing transforms what could have been small manageable habits into enormous financial burdens requiring increasingly aggressive contributions just to approach basic security. And this pressure often creates a dangerous emotional spiral, where people either feel so discouraged that they contribute too little out of hopelessness, or push themselves into unsustainable saving habits that eventually collapse under stress. What saddened Winston most was recognizing how often good intentions become the very reason people postpone starting, since many delay contributions while waiting for the perfect moment, when their finances feel completely organized and stable, not realizing that perfection rarely arrives in adult life, because there will almost always be another expense, another responsibility, another unexpected challenge competing for attention. And meanwhile, the years continue passing regardless of whether someone has started investing or not. He thought about coworkers in their 40s and 50s who suddenly discovered they needed to dedicate enormous portions of their income toward retirement simply because they spent earlier decades assuming they could always begin later. And the anxiety visible in those conversations left a lasting impression on him, because retirement planning had transformed from a calm, long-term process into a constant source of stress, dominating every budgeting decision they made. As the final pages of his notebook lay open before him, Winston slowly understood that many financial regrets are not born from dramatic failures, but from the quiet accumulation of postponed decisions that once felt harmless. And perhaps the cruelest aspect of time is that once lost, it cannot be repurchased no matter how much money someone eventually earns later in life. Outside, the city continued moving with its usual restless energy. But inside the apartment, Winston sat completely still, realizing that the greatest advantage any young investor possesses is not necessarily wealth or expertise, but simply the willingness to begin before they feel fully ready. Because in the world of long-term investing, starting imperfectly today is often infinitely more valuable than waiting years for ideal circumstances that may never truly arrive at all.